Hello, and welcome to NYFA's Webinar Wednesdays. This is a weekly virtual series specifically designed for Nebraska communities and housing partners. Today, we will be discussing the topic of the Prairie Queen Missing Middle Housing Development in Papillion, Nebraska. My name is Shannon Harner, and I'm the Executive Director at the Nebraska Investment Finance Authority, and today I am acting as your moderator. Due to the pandemic, NYFA is postponing its 2021 Annual Housing Innovation Marketplace Conference until March of 2022, the 28th through the 30th. Instead, we will continue to bring you weekly webinars in 2021. Today, our panelists are Mark Stursma and the Honorable David P. Black. Mark is a member of the AICP, American Institute of Certified Planners, and is currently Planning Director at the City of Papillion, and he's been in that position since 2004. For those of you who can't do math quickly, that's 16 years. The education of Mark is he has a Bachelor of Science in Community and Regional Planning with an emphasis in urban design from Iowa State University. And he has an MS Negotiation and Conflict Resolution from Creighton Law School, which he obtained in 2018. With over 25 years working professionally as a city planner, including private consulting experience, he has developed a planning philosophy, which is that he prefers negotiation and interest-based approaches to regulating development versus a strict regulatory approach. He believes that a rigid adherence to regulations, which can often be outdated, too often inhibits creativity and desired outcomes. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that today. We also have with us the Honorable David P. Black. David is the mayor of Papillion, and he has been in that position for 12 years. Prior to that, he held terms on both the Planning Commission and the City Council. Professionally, he is a commercial lender for a Nebraska community bank. I would also like to thank Joe Spitzen and Susan Pulek of NYFA, who are behind the scenes helping to monitor, chat, answer questions, and troubleshoot any tech problems that we may have. We would like to have all attendees save questions until the end of the presentation. You can use the question feature on the right to input your questions into chat, and NYFA will hold these until the end of the presentation. I'll try to group questions together and make sure that we're getting the most questions that we can answered in the time that we have with us. If you prefer to ask your question live, simply raise your hand and we can unmute you when that time comes. Again, thanks for attending, and at this point, I would like to pass the presentation over to Mark.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm going to let Mayor Black do a quick introduction.
I'd planned to do a little bit longer and share some of our lessons, but the presentation Mark and I have, some of my comments are interspersed in there, so you'll see us tag teaming. But I just want to thank everybody for letting us speak. We're excited about this project. We believe it's a very unique project, and we're honored to have it in Papillion. You're going to hear, if you're not familiar with Dan Perlick, he is a principal with a design company called Opticos out of San Diego, but he's actually from Columbus, Nebraska. And people are starting to hear the concept of missing middle, and Dan's the one kind of tagged that. So he would be a thought leader in that industry, and a lot of his influence is in here, and you'll see that throughout it. You'll also hear a gentleman by the name of Jerry Reimers. And if you're not familiar with Jerry, Jerry is a multifamily property management developer, and most of his life has been in urban development. If you're familiar with Omaha, kind of early entry into the Blackstone area before that got popular. So a lot of 4-plex, 6-plex, 8, 12-plex, turn of the century World War I type properties. So that's Jerry's perspective, is small scale urban multifamily. There was a point in time though where, and this is before we understood the concept of missing middle, Jerry had a concept of, in the development world, there's a lot of give and take between urban and suburban. Each of them think they're doing it the right way, and a lot of times their worlds don't cross. And Jerry, being an urban guy, thought suburban development was boring, and he could go into suburbia and do a better project. And what he wanted to do is take the best of urban, but not throw away suburban, pick what's good about suburban, and blend those concepts. And he did a multifamily apartment project, more traditional multifamily, called 1010 on the Lake, and Mark will talk about that a little bit later. But that was his first attempt at blending it, because if you think of urban and suburban on a spectrum, urban on one end, suburban on the other, when those start coming down in the spectrum and meet, what's that look like? And that's what Jerry was struggling with. And that was his 10-10 on the lake. He had an opportunity to do a project in Papillion, and we'll share the history of that a little bit later. He wanted to do his next version of that blending on that site. And once he started working on that, that's when he got introduced to Dan, and Dan's missing middle was working with the exact same problem. And so Jerry ended up hiring Dan, and the result of that is the project we're going to talk about. Mark.
Thank you, Mayor. We'll share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see the presentation now. So bungalows on the lake at Prairie Queen, as the mayor mentioned, we're going to talk a lot about missing middle. And I know this presentation is a follow-up to a presentation by Dan Perlich a few weeks ago. And if you were on that presentation, I think we may even do a quick poll to see how many of you were able to attend that presentation. Just a quick recap of some of the key talking points that Dan provided. He really emphasized that there's a growing percent of the market wants walkability. And that's something that we don't always do very well in suburban development. He also talked about how affordable housing is becoming a greater problem nationwide, actually worldwide. And that's something that we really need to work to try to solve. He talked a lot about how zoning is an out-of-date operating system. It's a tool that is not always consistent with what we're trying to accomplish. And that's something that I feel pretty passionately about too, that as was mentioned in the intro, when we rely on a rigid set of outdated rules, and then we wonder why we're not getting the development that we want, obviously there's a disconnect there. And so that's something where we'll talk about the entitlement process and the tools that we used to allow this project. And then another thing he mentioned is that so many of our cities, the majority of the zoning is for single family, and I would put Papillion in that same category. And so it's hard to think of the future and the future that we want without examining what we have and maybe some of the challenges that we have. And so I thought that it was a great presentation, and I think it's really good that we're having follow-up conversations. The site that we're going to talk about is, if you're familiar with Papillion, it's 132nd Street, just north of Highway 370, and it's on the west side of Prairie Queen Reservoir. And so if you look at the map, you can see my cursor, this is I-80, you have Highway 370, the black line is the outline of the Papillion city limits, the red star is the project location. And if I zoom in, so it's at the western terminus of a really important street corridor in Papillion, the Lincoln Road corridor, which was actually only completed. There were some gaps in that roadway about a year or so ago. So this roadway is where we are seeing a lot of the major development over the last several years in Papillion. It's an interesting road in that it functions as an arterial, but it's really a local street in that it does not extend east of 84th Street or west of 132nd Street. It has major parks with Halleck Park and City Park at its eastern terminus, along with downtown Papillion. As you move west, you've got the new community center, a lot of new development with Lincoln Way, Granite Lake, Granite Falls, Kingsbury Hills, and North Shore. You have 3 of the regional flood control reservoirs and parks. Obviously, Prairie Queen on the west. You also have under construction WP6 and WP7 along this corridor. You have Warner Ballpark and a future entertainment district. You have a new middle school. You have a new elementary school. And then at the western terminus, we have industrial development and lots of employment opportunity. So this corridor is very important in the growing of Papillion. It's a 3-lane cross section between 96th and 132nd Street with bike lanes. And so it's intended to be a community street, one that really serves not only the traveling public, but pedestrians as well. And I should mention from 96th to 84th Street, there's a 10-foot trail on one side. So we really thought long and hard about what this site should be, could be. It, in our mind, in our plan, we had kind of assumed it would be a combination of office and industrial. Maybe some industrial with headquarters offices, maybe with the office facing the lake. But as we'll talk about, it's really important to be flexible. When Jerry Reimer and Urban Waters came along with the proposal, we were open to it. We had actually had a proposal for multifamily on this site before. It was a very traditional multifamily development, 3-story, large buildings, large parking lots, and we said no. We were not interested in changing our plan for a project like that. And yet when Jerry came along with his reputation and with his proposal, we were willing to say, yeah, for the right project, we would be willing to explore something different. And this is just some data on, this is the, I'm sorry, go back to that. So this is the site itself. So Lincoln Way, this is that corridor I was talking about, 132nd Street looking north, the Prairie Queen Reservoir. This is after the initial grading, but the site is about 50 acres. It has a small piece on the south side of Lincoln Road, and then the remainder to the north. So this is what the site looks like from the air. And as you can see, you've got industrial on the west and the park on the east.
Let me jump in here just real quick, Mark, talking about how the project got started. You hinted at it, but I want to add a little more commentary there. I think whether you're large city, small city, rural or urban, a lot of our projects, I think we're dependent on developers coming to the city and saying, hey, we're going to buy some land, we've got a project, and then they start the entitlement process. This one was a little bit unique in Prairie Queen was an NRD dam site. And I don't know if the other NRDs in Nebraska do it this way, but the Papillion NRD, the Papio NRD, when we built our first recreation site 15 years ago, I think, Walnut Creek, we took an innovative approach. The city and the NRD partnered. These dam sites are for flood control. And a lot of flood control, they just build them, they put no amenities around there, you can't really use them. In other cases, they'll build it and it gets turned into a development and there's no public access. Neither one of those are good answers. So we partnered and we worked with the NRD and said, if you put a little bit more money into the design of the lake and make it a public amenity, the city will then take it over and maintain it as part of our park system. And so the NRD was willing to put a little bit more money into it, make it a recreational in addition to stormwater with public access, but they didn't have the ongoing operational expense of operating the park. They still maintained the water and the structure, but we ended up with a nice park out of it. That sparked a lot of economic development. Our Walnut Creek area just exploded with economic development, housing, commercial, retail. And so we followed that model with Prairie Queen and we're following it with WP 6 and 7. And so in that, we're now a partner at the table, and the NRD had some excess land from building the lake you see here. And so they were selling it at auction. It's a developable site. I happened to be at the auction and Jerry was at the auction and we did not know each other. But Jerry had a reputation of doing some really good quality high end and trying to be part of the community and build community. And so during the bidding process, he asked me if Papillion would allow apartments here. And I said no. This is while the bidding is going on for the land. The land price was not, so Jerry did not bid. The land price was not going up to meet the reserve, so they took a break. Jerry came over and explained the concept that I introduced of urban and suburban and blending and trying to build community. He had just about 2 minutes to present the idea. During the break, I kind of got excited about the project and I called Mark. We had about a minute to talk. And Mark said, I think I get what he's trying to do. We would support that. And so I went back to Jerry and said, Papillion will support your project. He jumped into the bidding and won the land. And that started the relationship. I say that because it was all built on the healthy relationship of me as an elected with the planning director. We have a very good relationship. And it was a relationship of Jerry's reputation. And that project would not have happened without relationships and trust. That was the key to this whole thing starting. And I don't want to discount anybody on this call building relationships and having trusted partners. That was the key that started it. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, and you think about the influence or the fact that I answered the call. I was in a meeting. I remember it vividly. I thought, oh, maybe I better get this, and I stepped out. And you're right. It was about a minute-long conversation. And I think that speaks to what we've learned in Papillion about flexibility and not being rigid in terms of our plans, in terms of our regulations, but still being willing to say no. The original, again, it was a simple pre-application discussion on a traditional multifamily at this site. We weren't interested in that. We were eyeing that economic development of office and industrial, but we have learned that the value of flexibility and being open-minded. So, and the mayor mentioned this, Urban Waters and Jerry Reimers have a great reputation in the Omaha Metro of doing creative projects, but this proposal was very different than anything they had done before. And they really bought into the characteristics of missing middle housing. And we'll speak about this. So Jerry went and hired Dan Perolik with Opticos, and he hired an engineering firm out of Minneapolis, SEH. And they had a very different approach to developing this site than what we had seen with the previous proposal. And really those characteristics of missing middle housing, you'll see play out in this project. And those characteristics, again, as defined by Dan, are these 6 on the screen. The located in livable communities, and that means walkable. A lot of times these types of projects you don't see in a suburban area. You see in a very urban, more dense area. You see as part of or adjacent to a downtown site. But that principle was definitely applied to this project. Compatible with single family homes. You'll see this project is basically a large multifamily project, but you'll see through the design that it would be very compatible adjacent to a single family neighborhood. Provides small, well-designed units. Again, you'll see that play out in the architecture and the scale of the buildings. Provides fewer off-street parking spaces. Parking is something we're going to really talk about because that is really one of the key aspects of the design of this project. Simple construction and affordability of design. Again, I think a lot of that is the scale of the buildings, and then creates a strong sense of community. And that is something that I don't know how much confidence we had going in, but we've really seen that play out. And so when Jerry came back to the city with Opticos and SEH, and they presented to us their vision for the development, these are some of the illustrations that they provided to us that were kind of inspirational imagery of what they're hoping to accomplish. And again, when you're regulating development, you see a lot of pretty pictures. But in this case, you can see what they're trying to accomplish. It's a place that's comfortable for people, that's walkable, and has a scale that does do just what they're saying, create a sense of neighborhood.
Stay on this picture real quick. Go back to that picture, Mark. This was a picture from the beginning that was very important to me. Mark shared Lincoln Street as a boulevard, and he talked about 84th Street to 132nd. If you're familiar with Papillion and you go east of 84th Street, you get into our Halleck Park area, Papio Fun Park, our ball fields, our Papio Bay Aquatics, the little pond down there that everybody knows is the duck pond. So get a point of reference. If you take that boulevard concept that Mark shared and you start at Papio Bay and the duck pond and you basically go through a mile-long park system, and it's the hub of the community and activity in the summer. Wide variety of activities. But then when you get to 84th Street, if you're not familiar with Papillion, like a lot of the small towns in Nebraska, Papillion's an 1870s railroad town. Railroad expansion is really what defined Nebraska. And so the original main line of the Union Pacific came through Papillion. And our downtown area where our library and our city hall are, that was sitting at the main line of the railroad. And that defined Papillion 1870 forward. And a lot of the building, while our downtown is smaller than most, it's still a lot of the original. We had really good core, and we're doing some downtown redevelopment. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But downtown redevelopment and keeping that history has been probably a #1 goal of our city council for 10 years. We've realized with our fast growth, the #1 top of mind for the elected officials is, as we grow, how do we not lose who we are? So how do we not get stuck and just say no to things because we don't want to grow? We don't want to do that, but we also don't want to grow and forget our history and forget the old timers and what got us to where we are. So we've really been balancing and respecting both the old and the new at the same time. And so while we'll do very large scale developments way on our western boundary, we've got a laser focus on our little 1 and 2 block downtown area. So when Mark talked about that boulevard, 84th Street is bookended with the 1870s core of the downtown. But as we grow and expand, that Lincoln Boulevard really becomes the center of the future town. And now we've bookended it with the 1870s railroad town on one end, and we bookended it with this picture on the other end. And you look at this picture, the scale of those buildings, some of them look like our 1870s railroad buildings, and they're small square foot retail, and they're walking in its community. And so this picture became really important of why we bought into Jerry's project and further definition of our corridor.
Yeah, the phrase "a picture is worth 1,000 words." These illustrations were, I think, instrumental in conveying the intent of this project. And again, we needed some convincing, and it was a big reach for Jerry and Urban Waters. If you look at this image, this is the previous project that Urban Waters did, 1010 on the Lake, as the mayor mentioned previously. And there are some real innovative features of this development, but as you can see, it's a fairly standard garden style 3-story apartment complex. And then you look at the image on the right, that is the next iteration of what Jerry's doing. And this is part of the site plan for the Prairie Queen project. So multiple types of buildings, very diverse, much different scale of building, very different feel. So as you can see, this is not a small iteration. This is a big leap to something different. So just some quick details. So again, located 132nd Lincoln Road, it's about a 50-acre site. Total number of units for the planned project is 650. That may evolve a little bit because we very deliberately allowed this to be, the units to be flexible. If there are certain unit types that will end up renting better than others, the market can dictate which units get perpetuated as the project gets built out. And then some of the things that we'll talk about are And to make this different from a traditional apartment complex, private entrances for each unit, no common hallways, more exterior sides and windows for natural light, unique loft style floor plans. We're going to talk again about parking and the garages. Really does create a sense of place, and then walkability is one of the key aspects. And early in our discussions with Jerry, he made the comment that he was pursuing, he would be disappointed, he said, if at some point he did not win national awards for this project. And that was, that's a pretty bold statement. And yet here we are in phase 1 of the development, and he's already won a national award. And this was just released. The National Association of Home Builders gave it a national award for up to 3-story projects. So for that to happen in phase 1 of this project is pretty telling. And Jerry has told us he's been contacted repeatedly by developers and urban designers from across the country wanting to learn about this project, hear about this project, and figure out how to replicate it. So again, it's a great model. If you haven't been to it in person, I would encourage you to go and experience it, walk around through it, and then think, how does this feel differently than other multifamily projects that you've experienced? So, and trust me, we'll get into the design. Again, this was raw ground, purchased at auction from the NRD. It required platting. This is the image of the plat. You can see it has multiple lots. Really, that was done for financing purposes. I think on the regulatory side, we had to constantly remind ourselves that this is an apartment complex, because the design of it is more reminiscent of individually owned buildings, owner-occupied units, that type of development. These lots that were created were more for just phasing of the financing. And then this is the site plan. And so to orient you, up on the image is east, so the Prairie Queen Reservoir, the lake and the park are on the top of the image. Cornhusker Road is on the west. Lincoln Road is on the left. Lincoln Road is on the right, and then 132nd is at the bottom. So a couple things I want to point out. Obviously, there's a lot of diversity in the type and scale of units. I think the maximum in terms of the concept is an 8-unit building. And I want to direct your attention to the street system. So these are public streets in the white, but then there are a series of alleyways that provide access to parking within the project. And then 130th Street is this street between the reservoir and the project. And this is again where I think Jerry really was smart to go find consultants who are familiar with waterfront development. I think probably 9 times out of 10, or maybe 99 times out of 100, according to what Jerry told us, you would back the most expensive high rent units to the lake, and you would have those directly on the water, instead of putting a public road in between those units and the park. But what they learned from examples in other communities is you actually over time have higher maintained values of property if there's a street between the water and the property. And the reason is it's aspirational. There's visibility of those units. People can see those units, the public can see those units, and they aspire to someday possibly live there. And so that was the key aspect of this.
Let me talk about that just real quick, Mark.
Absolutely.
So a couple of things building up on that road right there. This was the site plan that was also presented to us initially with those aspirational pictures we talked about earlier. And one of the challenges that Papillion had is from a financing perspective. Papillion is a large user of SIDs, and I know this can be a little bit controversial in some areas. And if you get outside of the Omaha Metro, they're really not used at all. In Nebraska, they're primarily a Douglas Sarpy financing tool, but it's only available outside city limits. This property, because the city participated on the development of Prairie Queen, this land was actually inside of city limits. So traditional development for Papillion would have meant we enabled the SID as a temporary financing tool to help the developer. That was not available on this project. It's inside of city limits. About the only other tool available to cities to aid in development or redevelopment is TIF. Papillion is very, very strict on our use of TIF. In fact, we have never TIF'd a project. We're working on doing our very first one now, and it truly is an old industrial blighted area. We would not TIF basically a cornfield. And so TIF was off the table from the elected's perspective. And the developer, to hit an aspirational project, had some increased cost. And it really was the road that Mark is talking about. And so we were presented with a real problem of, we see the aspiration of the project, we have a high level of trust in what Jerry's attempting to do, we want to accomplish that, but we've got to come to the table to enable it or it's not going to happen. And so what the city did is we historically do not build roads. Again, that's where we use the SIDs to help build our infrastructure. But we did come to the table and agreed to contribute and build that boulevard road that Mark shows. And we're using the valuation of this project. So we've got a mechanism where the developer is actually pre-funding it, and then we're doing a repayment. And so it's a pretty important partnership. But I think that's a point then to mention, both doing this project, taking some land that we had originally maybe envisioned as Class A office overlooking the water, transforming it to multifamily. I mentioned the trust and Mark and I relationship, but I'll say absolute key to that was a healthy, functional city council. Our elected officials on the city council have a high respect for the professionals in city. And so when Mark started kind of validating what Jerry was seeing, and then we could make the numbers work, the city council got on board pretty quick, and all of the decisions through here ended up being 8-0 votes. So again, relationships and trust, absolutely key to making this happen.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And I would add, I think there was some innovative thought on funding that road where it was developer funded with the reimbursement by the city when the development reached some target valuations. So the city was protected. Now we're down the road a little bit. We were very conservative on those target valuations. As everybody knows, costs have gone up pretty dramatically in in building expenses, particularly concrete and lumber. But fortunately, the valuation has come in actually double of what our projections were that we based our reimbursement analysis on. So we're feeling really good about the arrangement that we have. And as Mayor said, we have trust with the developer, and so we think we're more than in a good position to cover those costs. And again, I would say, from a public perspective, this road is good for the development, but really good for the public. If you think about all of the reservoirs throughout the metro area like this, you don't find many that have a public road that goes right down to the park and by the water. And we're pretty excited about the opportunity this creates to maybe make this park more accessible. And accessible to people who maybe otherwise wouldn't have access to that. Even mobility challenged people who just want to go and park and look over the park and the water. This road will create that opportunity. So it really is a good from a private perspective and a public perspective. Here is an aerial view of the project under construction. This was taken in about 2019. And then this is a more recent project. So that shows about 1 year of progress. And you can start to see the architecture. You can start to see the diversity. The rent structure of this project ranges. So The goal is to have units under $1,000, so in that $900 range, and to have units, there are some units more in the $3,000 range. It's all rental. And I want to start by focusing on these units along Lincoln Road. Those are the largest, highest rent units. You can see some of these are actually designed to be live-work units. And this is what they look like from street level. You see the Caniglia's Pizza and Pub sign. There's a yoga studio in the same building. And quick side note, live-work is something that's often tried, not always successful. Already this has proven to be extremely successful, and that's evident in the fact that we've had a parking problem. You know, sometimes you have to remind people that parking problems are great problems to have. You know, we've had that in our downtown, and we have to remind businesses that if you're struggling to meet the parking demand, that's good. That means we have a lot of customers. Both of the businesses that are here so far, you know, have been doing really, really well. So again, it's just some imagery of those particular units. And there you can see from the opposite angle, looking to the west. And then on the rear, these are the units that have attached garages. So it's basically a 3-story unit and with an attached garage. And I think one of the key things on here you can see overlooking to the east, those units were placed along Lincoln Road. And so the tallest buildings frame the Lincoln Road corridor. And, you know, there were some questions asked, why wouldn't you put the most expensive units along the water? Well, again, that would detract from the experience of the rest of the community, from the rest of the neighborhood. There's still some excellent views overlooking the neighborhood and the lake, but, you know, really there was a focus by the developer and by Dan, the designer, to think about the neighborhood and the sense of community and making sure to maximize everybody's access and visibility of the lake, rather than having the highest rent units kind of take up those views.
One of the other things that the two pictures show, whether you're on Lincoln looking at the front or you're looking at this one to the back, is the critical importance of the garage placement. Everything in here is either alley access or rear facing garages. So if you're on any street, you don't see garages. And so you think of building a sense of community and somebody being on their front porch and coming out of the front porch. People are seeing each other, they're interacting with each other, they're not seeing a garage, but the garages are still there. So very important in the design.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Mayor. The parking and how that was handled was really critical to the design, and that was something that from a regulatory standpoint we had to be creative. You can see here this image shows parking on the street. You don't see any garages or driveways on the street. You can think about the experience and the walkability of this neighborhood. Quick story on this particular unit. This is one of those $900 units, and then on the building next to it, that's probably more of a $1,500 to $2,000 unit. We were giving a tour of this site, and it was about a 100-degree day. It was brutally hot, and in this unit there was an elderly lady unloading her groceries, and she was able to park her car right next to the door to her unit and unload her groceries without having to walk across a parking lot and down a hallway and up a flight of stairs. You know, and I happened to start chatting with her. I actually helped her, you know, carry her groceries to her unit. She invited me into her unit. I'm not sure that would have felt very comfortable in another environment, but she just kept gushing about how much she loved the neighborhood. She loved her neighbors and how she's had a chance to meet so many of her neighbors. And she'd never had that experience in any other apartment that she'd lived in. And then Jerry has told me stories too of the interaction of neighbors and maybe the social aspect of this development and the diversity that we didn't appreciate as much going in, but we appreciate so much now, that by not separating the people by income, by socioeconomic status, you actually that builds on that sense of community, and that's become another really important aspect of this neighborhood. So again, as you look at these images, think about the experience of living here versus living in a traditional apartment complex, and also realize that the density of this project is actually higher than can be achieved in most traditional apartment complexes. And a lot of that is because we allow the parking on the street to qualify as the required parking. So you don't need those big parking lots taking up so much space. So here again, you can see the parking on the street right by the door to the units. Again, I've heard from residents that really gives a sense of security. They can see their car from their window. And here you can again see the treatment of the garages and the parking. So here's an alleyway, and that's where the garages are located. Here's another alleyway. This is where the garages are located. There's no driveways. There's no garages facing the street. And then this is one of those alleyways. And this is a case too where we struggled on the regulatory side. Public Works and Fire really wanted these alleyways to be 24 feet in width. And the designer was adamant that would destroy the feel of this neighborhood. And they were pushing for a 16-foot alley. So that's a pretty significant difference.
Let me jump in there real quick. This was probably the first bump in the road we had on the development, besides the financing and how do we do that, which was the boulevard conversation. So we've had all these aspirational pictures. We've got the relationship with Jerry. We're excited. We see the site plan. We're learning. Everything is great and everything's excitement. And so that's with the developer. It's the pre-application meetings. It's myself as an elected, sharing with some of the other electeds, and it's Mark from planning. They then submitted the formal application, and now the bureaucratic process starts. And of course, the first thing then is in the internal world, the site plan and all the application materials go out for comment. So now building is seeing it, fire is seeing it, engineering is seeing it, public works is seeing it. At that point in time, they're not educated on the project. And they just see it as another application, and they just do what they always do, and they start reviewing it and doing all of their traditional comments based on their standards. And a large number of comments came back, and that was then consolidated and sent back to Jerry based on the initial application was the city's comments. That was the first phone call I got from Jerry, and he wanted to meet. And he said, if these comments are going to destroy the development, and if I have to meet these, I can't do the project, and I'm not going to do the project. And so called a meeting with Mark, administration, myself, and Jerry. And basically, again, tried to say, what in the comments is destroying the aspirational side of it, and why can't you accomplish it? And it was this alleyway that Jerry started really talking about. And for the comments, we're going to make this a traditional wide alley for the ease of public works and fire. And it was based on standards. Jerry said, I can't do it. But Jerry understood alternate parts of the code that traditional reviewers probably don't look at. And so Jerry, again, challenging us and educating us of this is not a public street. It is an alley in an apartment complex. And here's alternate parts of the code that you can use. And through that discussion, we then internally, between Mark and I at administration, challenged the professionals in engineering, building, and fire of what trumps? If we get into an issue and all things are equal, do standards trump design, or does design trump standards? And we walked away in this case saying we believe in the design and all the goals. In one way, design trumps standards. And so that empowered Mark internally to have a little bit more power when it came to the other professionals in trying to resolve conflicts and work through some items. And there were some hard conversations. A lot we gave, there's a couple Jerry gave, but it was that meeting and this issue that really gave Mark and planning a lot of power and ability to push this project through the bureaucracy.
Yeah, and I'll add, we'll talk in a minute about the tools that we use, but we used a mixed use zoning to allow that creativity and flexibility. So again, this is that alleyway, and if you can see in the image there, the alley itself is 16 feet wide, and within that 16 feet on the edge is stamped concrete. So you've got 2 feet of stamped concrete that actually makes it feel even narrower. And then from garage door to garage door is 26 feet. So if you imagine this alley being 24 feet instead of 16 feet, you'd be adding an additional 8 feet. Suddenly this alley doesn't feel like a slow moving corridor where you go park your car. It feels like a public street that you drive 30 miles an hour down. And again, that's part of why it was so important to look at the width of these alleyways. And in plan view, you can see, again, I think from a regulatory standpoint, we had to continually remind ourselves that this is an apartment complex. And if you look at these individual buildings, I think it helps us to imagine that as a single building versus multiple buildings, especially from a fire code perspective. And
you want me to talk about the knock boxes at this point?
Yeah, I think that would be perfect, Mayor.
So right in the middle, you see the 4 buildings. If you think of this as plattable lots, that's basically one lot with 4 primary buildings on it, which in some jurisdictions is going to be a problem, and it caused us a problem. But again, if you see it as an apartment building, it's just, and wrap a common wall around that entire lot, it's just one building, and the green spaces become interior hallways. What that did from a fire perspective, and Jerry did not win this battle. I tried to get him to win it, but it's one he gave up on. So in the fire world, fire code says on commercial buildings and multifamily, you have to have a knock box on the exterior door. So if there's a fire, EMS can get to the knock box and get the key and get in, and now they are inside the building in the common hallways. Once you're in the common hallway, no interior door has a knock box on it, and they are all unique keyed, and the fire department does not have those keys. And so in that entire building, you had maybe 1 or 2 knock boxes on the exterior doors. In this model, we removed the exterior wall, and the common hallways are now accessible to anybody. However, the fire marshal sees now every one of those doors as an exterior door. Code requires a knock box on an exterior door. So we made ease of entry easier by taking the outside walls away. However, we increased the cost of Jerry's project because now every exterior door requires a knock box. Doesn't sound like a big deal, other than on the low end, a knock box is probably $250. In Jerry's mind, I have 650 units. 250 times 650 is a large number. And in Jerry's mind, if that's an operational expense for investors, if I put a cap rate to that, that was $1 million to $1.5 million valuation conversation. And fire is saying you have to have the knock boxes. Jerry is saying, I made your ease of entry easier by taking the wall down completely, just walk in. It was a very contentious issue when you start dealing with life safety, and that was some challenges. We got about 3 or 4 life safety examples, but a simple thing that said, just put a $200 thing on a door. Yeah, but 650 of them and an operational expense, that's $1 million valuation question. So we were challenged with alternate parts of the code a lot on this project. And again, having a good relationship with the fire marshal was absolutely critical in this project.
I'll mention very quickly too in this this aerial view. Notice again the parking behind the buildings, the on-street parking, and then again, as was pointed out, individual small buildings. It actually is, as you said, Mayor, is safer in the sense that there's a separation between units from a fire perspective, easier entry. I think if we were to do this project again, we're better educated and probably more sensitive to the effect on the developer. We would probably push harder on our end to help with some of those things. Again, just more views of the development. Again, you see the diversity. So on that parking, we were able to reduce the off-street parking requirement to 1 stall per unit. And then all the additional parking requirements are handled on street. So again, that helped us get the cars parked where we want them and helped us not have to have those large parking lots that take away from those values of missing middle housing, and particularly the walkability. And one other value I think is, I just learned this term recently in a presentation. It really promotes chance encounters. The story of helping the lady with her groceries, I don't know that, that only happens in an environment where, one, you're actually walking past each other in a public space where you feel safe, and in a place where you feel comfortable interacting with others. And so I just visiting the site, I felt that firsthand. And I've certainly heard testimony from the people who live there that is the case. It really feels like a community.
When you hinted at economic diversity, Mark, and Jerry's got some data on this. I don't know it intuitively, but the example he's given me, he believes that this is probably one of the more economically diverse areas in the metro area. And one of the examples that he gave, it was also an elderly lady. He says there's a lady on fixed income, not many resources, that does rent here, and she's in one of the units that Mark pointed out. But right next door is a doctor who's paying $3,000 a month in rent. And they're both just in the same neighborhood. They become friends. And he said in her mind, she's living in the rich area, and the doctor feels I live in this great community, and I've got this grandma next door to me, and they become good friends. And he says that happens all throughout the development.
Yeah, I think the social aspect of it is one of those things that we did not appreciate enough going in. But it's something that now I think we're more aware of and we'll want to try to replicate with future development. As you can see, with this building design, the interior spaces have a lot more windows than what you might see in traditional apartments. I don't think there's any unit that has only a single wall of windows. They all have at least 2, and in most cases 3 or 4 sides of the unit have exterior windows. And so you can see it's very bright and well lit on the interior. So on how do you, from a regulatory perspective, do a project like this? And there were some options. It certainly does not fit very neatly into traditional Euclidean zoning, which Papillion uses. Most cities throughout the country use. Often you would use a form-based code for something like this. moving to a form-based code would be a wholesale change in how we regulate development. And fortunately, we rely heavily in Papillion on mixed-use zoning. And as we worked with Jerry and Dan, we said, I think we can do this through a typical mixed-use agreement. I think the original agreement that they proposed was 93 pages long. We actually worked with them to reduce that down to, I think the final product was maybe 42 or 43 pages. We've learned lessons through mixed-use zoning. You don't want the city over-regulating. The initial design regulations that they proposed were measuring to the inch, awnings to street curves, the specific size and dimensions of windows, very, very specific regulation. In this case, we have a master developer that intends to own the entire project. So, we'll get to next steps later, but at least in this case, we were able to do this project through I wouldn't say a simple, but a tool that we use frequently in a mixed-use development agreement. And mixed-use zoning is basically zoning by agreement. And it's something that lets us be flexible. I will say that we're very cautious in our mixed-use zoning to not use it as a variance. We always want to use mixed-use zoning to encourage better design, more creative design. We can be flexible in that we can solve problems for the developer. For example, we can trade. We can say, well, if you increase the design requirements of this more visible elevation, we can reduce the design requirements of the less visible ones. That's just a simple example of some of the horse trading that we do in a mixed use agreement. But it's a tool that could be abused if you didn't have, I would say in our case, a council and elected officials who are very involved in the design of development and have high expectations and won't allow that tool to be used to, as I mentioned, be a variance and to just get around our traditional regulations. So this slide is just some of the illustrations that are in the mixed use agreement. As you can see, it establishes some expectations and some general design criteria. We do have the flexibility administratively to change the site plan to maybe allow the developer to increase the number of some types of units over others. The things that would take a major amendment would be anything that affects surrounding properties or would affect a hard regulator like a building height or a setback or something of that nature. And again, these are just some of the illustrations. This building is a fiveplex. One of the key criteria that Jerry had, lessons learned from his other projects, are he never wants the bedroom in one unit to be stacked on a bedroom from another unit. That's just a lesson he's learned from managing multifamily projects. And so this, you might glance at this and think, oh, that's a really nice big house. If you think about living here and somebody asks, well, where do you live? And you point to this building, wow, you live in a really nice house. Well, in reality, it's an apartment building and it's multiple units. But again, from a pride perspective, from an experience perspective, you really do feel like you're just living in a mansion. You're just in a small part of that mansion. And then these are just some 3D renderings of some upcoming buildings. So from thinking about what's next, from the city perspective, we're very excited about this project. We would love to replicate this project. We know there's development interest in replicating it. But again, as I mentioned before, this project was done by a master developer. There was a high degree of trust with this developer. It was clear that this developer hired the professionals necessary to push this design through. How do we now make it easier for other developers or even individuals to replicate this? And so we're thinking about it. The first step is where, and we're in the process of updating our comprehensive plan. And just very quickly, the Cape Art Road corridor has emerged as a really important corridor in the future of Papillion. So in this illustration, this is Highway 370, and then Cape Art Road is the next major east-west corridor through Sarpy County. And it's predominantly undeveloped now, except you'll see on the west end, that's the Highway 50. That's where we have a lot of emerging industrial and business development, major employment center for the county, and I would say for the state. And then the east end of the corridor, you have the city of Bellevue and Offutt Air Force Base, another major employment opportunity. So this corridor we envision as having mixed-use development at the major intersections, and that can be seen more clearly here. And we see opportunity for this missing middle housing being a key part of those neighborhood centers at these major intersections. And if we can build enough density on this corridor, we see this as actually being a transit-ready corridor. Again, you could live, work, and play on Cape Art Road, ample employment opportunity along the corridor and certainly at each end. And to build that density, I think missing middle housing is going to be a key aspect of that.
One other thing then, as far as the broader city and what's next, well, I'll cover this slide and then I'll do mine.
So this is just a rendering of what we envision may be, at least an example of those mixed use nodes. And as you can see, there's open space built in. These white buildings are more of the services and commercial and possibly more traditional higher density residential buildings. But then it's surrounded by missing middle type housing. And again, this is a diagram. It's not intended to be literal, but incorporating that missing middle housing into this neighborhood is really important. And if you want to dig into the details, you'll notice that these are all alley loaded. Again, really focusing on not having driveways and garages facing the streets. And by doing that, you really promote the walkability and the comfort of the pedestrian within this type of development.
I think the comment that I want to make at that point then, again, Jerry's is a multifamily project, but when you drive out there, average person does not see it as an apartment complex. They see it as a neighborhood of 1 to 4 family residential. I even had somebody say that there's, well, it's 1 to 4 family, and in their mind, it was a single family with some duplexes and triplexes. There's not one single family in that entire development, but the perception that it's creating, because it is creating the neighborhood. The questions then that come out of it, and some of it is the next steps, and we're dealing with it in the comp plan, and what Mark just shared is, one, if somebody just wants to build that project at a smaller scale, how is that done? I want to build an apartment complex, but not that big. How does that work? But also in a new development, historical development creates neighborhoods of like houses. You've got your $200,000 to $300,000 houses in one neighborhood. You've got your $300,000 to $400,000 in another neighborhood. You've got your executive homes in another neighborhood. And we segregate historically based on price. If we want to start blending those, which is what missing middle is doing, how do we blend the price points? And how do we blend the multifamily and the single family? So maybe I want to build a triplex in a traditional single family neighborhood and create an opportunity now for ownership. I may want to own the duplex. I live in one side, rent out the other. That was very common turn of the century back in the World War II timeframe. And you go into the older parts of Omaha, that was very common, and we've lost that. And a lot of what exists in those areas, people say they want, but the regulations don't allow it now. That's what we're learning and trying to get back. How do you do this in an ownership model? The other thing is some of the conversations that are occurring is tying missing middle to affordable housing. Missing middle is not affordable housing. It's a tool within affordable housing, but if you hear missing middle, it's not just talking low-end housing. We mentioned Jerry's got $3,000 rents. So one of the conversations occurring at the electeds level that Mark's facilitating in Papillion is housing types. What are the appropriate housing types and how do we mix those and include those in so we get the diversity of housing? And in that context, you'll get some affordable housing, but it's not just saying everything's got to be affordable housing. It's the mix and the blend and the economic diversity and the blend of the housing. So whether it's a multi-project like Jerry or it's an ownership model, blending all of those. And those are some of the things that we're still working through and figuring out and involving from the regulatory side. Also with the scale, you saw a lot of renderings of the different types of buildings that really exist out there. You could pick up one or two of those buildings and put it on a lot in an infill project. And so this also has infill. And in Papillion, we are doing that. It's kind of our next test. In our little 1870s downtown area, we had a large lot behind a public works building that everybody just saw as junky industrial. I don't know, it's about a 2-acre site. And we're acquiring a small piece next to it. So we're talking about an infill project of 2 to 3 acres. We are working with Jerry to do a missing middle project in that 2 to 3 area. And that will be in the midst of traditional single family neighborhood in a small downtown area. And that'll be our next evolution of testing the project out at a smaller scale.
All right. So we've had several questions come in during the course of your presentation. I'm going to look at some of them have actually already been answered as you've been going through, but we'll look at a few of them, and then other people, if you have questions, please put them into the chat at this time, or also feel free to raise your hand. Let's start off with questions that are functional about the Prairie Queen project itself. So I'm just going to throw a couple of them at you right now. We had some questions about whether there are elevators in the 3-story or 2-story buildings, just thinking about disabled access and elderly ease of access, as well as whether there's been consideration to including libraries or schools in the development.
I'm not aware of any elevators in any of the buildings. Those units that front onto Lincoln Road are the tallest buildings, and they are 3-story, but one of the design aspirations of missing middle housing, again, as defined by Dan Parolick, is 2.5 stories is kind of the target. And so, yeah, there, at least in the products that have been built so far, there has not been any elevators. I believe there are units that are single story. And so there would be some opportunity for ADA accessibility, but not in those taller buildings.
But Jerry has incorporated that. Even in the couple of the multi-stories are actually stacked units. So the entire first floor can be a unit, and that is accessible, and he does have those in the project.
So there had been a question about retail buildings. I know there's retail in some of the buildings that have housing on top of it. Are there any plans for standalone retail, or is each building mixed if there is retail in it?
In Jerry's model, he's staying with the live work. And in that Lincoln, those 3-story will be on either side of the street, and they'll all have the 1st-story retail, but he is building it with flexibility. And so the way it's built, depending on what the need is, that 1st floor could be a living unit, a studio apartment, but it could also be, in the Caniglia's Pizza as an example, those individuals owned a house in another part of the metro area. They wanted a business, and they actually sold their house. They live in the 2 stories above it, and then their restaurant is on the 1st story. And so Jerry's got it blended of the mix of retail and business. I mean, retail and housing.
So you talked a little bit earlier about how do you do something like this in an ownership model? Have you given any consideration to, for instance, condoing some units within those types of buildings, and what does that look like? What are the challenges?
We're actually starting those conversations. A lot of developments that come up, developers may want to just carve off a piece and say we're doing villas here, or we're going to create a lot here and do something with it. We're not sure. We want something higher density. It's those opportunities we see to start introducing the missing middle concepts as we learn and put them in Papillion's context. And we actually had a planning retreat with the full city council, Mark and Dan, to start working through that in Papillion's context so we can start educating the development community on that, and then Mark can start introducing it.
So you've talked a lot about the benefits of the mixed income housing, and as opposed to the stratification where you have a neighborhood that has the 200 to 300 or a neighborhood that's 400 to 500. And in this development, which has those larger ranges, what is the difference in the quality of construction to make it affordable for the developer to have those different rents? Are they substantially similar? Is there a question of have and have not? How does that look within this development? If you just explain that a little bit.
It's probably a webinar topic all of its own that you want Jerry to go into, because as he did the project, he's learned a lot. And the economics is a very important piece of it. How do you get your bank financing for a project like this? How did this project perform during COVID and rental rates? I mean, there's a lot of lessons here that Jerry's got real experience with, and I might encourage you to look at that as a topic of its own. But what I'll tell you is when Jerry started the project, there was no concept like this. Dan Paraluk will say it's actually the first full-scale missing middle new development in the nation, and he highlighted that in his book that he just published. And that presented some problems for Jerry because he didn't know how it was going to perform when he built it. We didn't know how it was going to perform. And so a traditional multifamily project would have picked a price point that the market's demanding and built a whole bunch of that. Let's go build the $1,000 ones, and then let's go do the 2,000s. In Jerry's case, he needed to create and understand the market. And so initially, and this is a cost of learning, initial cost was probably a little bit higher because he actually built one of each price point at the beginning to understand which ones were going to rent. And then once he understood that, then he could start just building. He had actually ended up finding out every price point built. And if you look at his 900 versus his 1,000 from a quality of construction, there is no difference on those. He's getting the economy of scale from the density that he's creating with this new concept. What would have been invaluable land of a parking lot just became a revenue stream. And so whichever side is being built, that's valuation and revenue. So he's building a neighborhood, and there really is not a have and a have not. Literally, the fixed income is living next door to the doctor in the same level of construction, in the same neighborhood, interacting in the same community.
Yeah, I will just quickly add, we just met with Jerry, and again, with the pretty dramatic increases in the price of materials and construction, he's absolutely committed to this diversity of rent rates and trying to make sure he can continue to provide units under $1,000. And so he is evaluating how to do that, and may make some, I wouldn't say reduction in the quality, but maybe the size of some of the units to make sure that he can still provide units in that price range.
Had another couple of questions just about some functional aspects of the development. Do the buildings have fire sprinklers? I assume they do, because I think that's in the new code. And how do they manage trash?
I'm not sure how they manage trash. That's a good question. On the fire sprinkler, that's an interesting and poignant question, given a discussion we're having just this week on some changes or some new interpretations of the fire code. Now, if you want to tell the story, Mayor, if you want me to.
Go ahead.
So yes, the buildings are all sprinkled. There is a in the building code, there is now requirements, and I think they've been in there for some time, but there was a future date of when they were to be enforced for low frequency alarms. And it's an alarm that help. It's more likely to wake you up if you're asleep. It's more noticeable by people with hearing limitations and things like that. And it is significantly more expensive, which is something that if you remember the story about the Knox boxes, I think we're more sensitive to those types of changes now. Especially, Jerry came to us and said, okay, now the fire marshals, not just in Papillion, but everywhere, are now enforcing this. I already have building permits for X number of buildings. I'm already well into construction. If I have to retrofit, tear out the wiring or retrofit the wiring that I've already put in place to put these new systems in place, that's hundreds of dollars per unit. And so I think we were, more flexible in terms of, no, we're going to honor what we've already approved. We'll only look at new building permit applications if we're going to change how we now enforce the building codes. And that seems all reasonable, but I think the Knox boxes are a good example of how we were trained to be more sensitive to those things, because just a few dollars more per unit can have big ramifications on the expenses for the developer.
Well, and especially when you put it back into the context of affordable housing, those nickel and dimes are what are causing the affordability housing issue. So if from the government side, we can start being very conscious to those and push out those nickels and dimes, we're coming to the table slowly helping be part of the solution on affordable housing.
What will be the complete streets transportation corridor along the route? And this person's comment was, young people want bike lanes.
No.
Yeah, so if you go back to the boulevard that Mark talked about on Lincoln, it's being built a little bit with that concept. So within the Prairie Queen project itself, it's very walkable and bikeable. You can go down the hill and you're at Prairie Queen Recreation Area, which has a 4-mile walking trail around it that's connected. The bike trail is along the whole boulevard. And then if you go cross Prairie Queen going east, you can still do that on the trails. You end up at a traditional neighborhood. There's an elementary school there that these people would go to. And you're also at Warner Park, a AAA baseball stadium. So you've got the entertainment aspect as well. Staying on the bike trail, you start moving east. You end up at 2 more dam sites. Each of those have their own trails around them. So again, the amenities around, that's all interconnected. And the bike trails and the walking trails are all integrated there. You can actually then get all the way down to 96th Street, and then you're at Papillion's new community center, a 200,000 square foot community center we built. That connects you to a 2-mile long park system with its own trails. In there, you're also connected to the metro-wide trail system, so you can actually end up navigating the whole metro area on the existing trail system, and then you're back down to our downtown area. So it's all, you can do it all on bike, you can do it on walk. The other thing we've started to do is integrate B-Cycle Share program. The city funded through community betterment dollars a B-Cycle Share station in our downtown area down on 84th Street, which is on the trail. And then we just this spring put one in at our community center. And so those are interconnected, and we would like to see one then at the baseball stadium, one at Prairie Queen, and then one at Jerry's project. So we're thinking of the whole interconnectivity.
And I would just quickly say too, it all goes back to decisions made years ago to make Lincoln Road and that entire corridor pedestrian friendly with the bike lanes. And so this project is very pedestrian friendly by itself, but it's part of a larger bicycle infrastructure system.
The other important part, the picture we're looking at, literally across the street to the west, you enter an industrial area, and it's a major employment center. And we got a couple of new employers that are creating about 1,500 new to market jobs. Papillion Foods, which is a division of Hormel, and then Amazon has a couple of facilities being built over here. And so again, if you don't have transportation, you could live here and go to work. And those jobs are above $15 an hour minimum wage. They've got health insurance, dental insurance. And so again, if you've been lower income, unemployable, there's some affordable housing and you could walk to work.
That's great. Another question we've received is there a plan to target low to moderate income people to live within the units, not necessarily housing vouchers, but maybe a limit on the amount of income an individual can have while living in that unit.
Jerry, from what I understand, I'm not sure, we're looking a little bit more at the private side, and so I don't want to speak for him. I don't believe any of this financing came from like HUD financing, where there'd be the low to moderate income requirements. I don't know if I can directly answer it, but I don't think it's necessarily incorporated into this specific project.
Another question that someone had revolves around what does the next step look like regarding, for instance, sustainability, like solar, geothermal, green energy saving measures, as you're thinking about either this project or some of those other areas that you've identified?
Take that, Mark.
Those are all great things. It's hard on the regulatory side to require them, but it's something that, again, thinking about the process of negotiation and regulation, I think that's where there's a give and take, and if a project comes along and incorporates that into the development, then we have the opportunity to give credit for that. Versus, if we just rely on a standard zoning ordinance, it doesn't have that type of opportunity built into it.
So it sounds like much of the success of this project was the open and willing collaboration between the government side, the planning side, and the developer. What do you see as a role for other cities or villages in, for instance, going out and creating these types of relationships or encouraging developers to do these types of projects, especially in light of LB 866?
I'll give an answer, then let Mark weigh in more on the LB 866 side. This is really an evolving concept in the state of Nebraska. We're unique in that Jerry was already working through it before the concept of missing middle came out, and just happened to come to this land and right place, right time. No magic of why we got it other than right time, right place, and trust, and what I talked about earlier. The good news is it's exactly what everybody's trying to solve for. So we're probably a year or two ahead of what everybody's struggling with. And we're continuing to learn, and we're evolving, and we don't have the answers yet. My fear a little bit is people latch onto a word and a concept of missing middle, and it now becomes the buzzword, kind of the corporate speak. And so all of our developers, all of our engineering companies start saying we're doing missing middle housing. In reality, all they're doing is what they've always done of, let's just do some smaller scale houses, get rid of the setbacks, leave the garages on the front, and everything looks the same. And we end up with what we've always had on the lower end. We need to change the market, and that's what we're attempting to do, at least in Papillion, is redefine what that standard cookie cutter development used to look like that ends up with the same thing we've always had. I say that just to say a little bit of fear. If the legislature does more, that's going to force us to react just to what the legislature says. I would hope a little bit they let us evolve and learn and take the good stuff and learn from it. And I don't want to say the good developers, because all the developers are good. The leading edge creative developers will really start understanding the concept and learning from the Dans and the Jerrys and adding this creativity. And I think the more developers that do it, and the more cities that are doing it, we're going to evolve together and understand it and end up seeing some good products. One of my fears from the legislative side, or just if we just latch onto the corporate speak of missing middle, is we may end up with some of the mistakes from the 1970s. There's some examples, and I can think of some neighborhoods in Lincoln and Omaha that are prime examples where they were single family, traditional single family, suburbia type houses from World War II on into the 50s. And then the idea of we need to create density, we need diversity, we need all of that. Well, all we did is we knocked down some single family and put up traditional apartments, and they really look out of place, and it was not good development. This concept accomplishes those same goals? How do we get the mixing and the diversity, but still create community and keep value? And it's going to be a learning process for it. Mark?
Yeah, I would reiterate the term missing middle was Dan Perolick is given credit for coining that phrase, but it's not a universally his definition is not universal to the phrase missing middle, and so we do need to be careful about buzzwords. It happens every time there's a new great definition of development. It happened with new urbanism. It happened with mixed use development. It's happening with missing middle. So I would encourage people on the regulatory side to be aware of that. Really look at the design, be aware of the characteristics of missing middle housing that I just put up on the screen. Apply that to a development proposal that's claiming to be missing middle. Be willing to say no to projects that don't meet the criteria that you're after, that don't accomplish the goals of the community, but be willing to be flexible on those projects that are accomplishing those goals. I think that's really important. And then on LB 866, I know there are some upcoming discussions on that. I think it's an opportunity for all of us to work together, and maybe this is the instigator, to think about how do we as regulators, make it easier for diversity in housing and more affordability in housing. With any regulation, it's not a magic bullet. If you look at the requirements of LB 866, it requires some reporting by cities. That's just a work effort. It doesn't affect change, and it requires us to allow more types of housing in our zoning districts. I'd tell you that we already do all of those, duplexes and threeplexes and fourplexes. You can do in all of our residential districts, and so it's the market that really determines what types of housing gets built. I think the value of this project and why we're so excited to share it is that it's a model that, hey, these can not only be economically viable for a developer, but they can create those things that we're trying to accomplish, that diversity, both from an economic standpoint and from a social standpoint. And again, the next hard step for us is how do we make this easier to replicate so that you don't need to have somebody like Jerry Reimer, who did a tremendous amount of work and deserves an awful lot of credit for not only pursuing really good innovative design, but taking the risk. Doing something new is very risky, and it took somebody like Jerry Reimer to do that. Now let's learn from this example and make it easier for everybody else.
I think the last statement I'll make is don't discount the importance of educating the elected officials. Again, it's a hard concept, but once the process starts, that's going to your planning commission, it's going to the city council. And the more they understand the missing middle and the goals, the better questions they can ask of applicants and the professionals. And I think in some cases, it's going to be the electeds asking the questions that empower the professionals then to challenge the way things are done, because they know they just can't slide through the traditional old things. Or if they want to do something innovative, they know there's some electeds and appointeds that will support that, and they'll prompt the questions and start the discussions. We've got a couple of council members that have really gotten on board and are really learning and understanding it. And we just did a educational retreat with both Planning Commission and City Council just on missing middle and basically this presentation to start that education. So we really are getting a dialogue going.
That's great. All right, well, we have about 2 minutes left. Mayor Black, I know you said that's your last statement. Mark, do you have any last statement? Any words of wisdom for our participants?
Really appreciate the opportunity to present this. Again, I would just reiterate that creativity, in order to have creative design, you have to be willing to be open-minded, to be flexible. Relationships are really important, and that requires good communication. And I know that takes time and that takes effort, but I would say those are the keys to the success of this project. We were willing to take the time to really listen to the developer, work with the developer and their design professionals, and figure out ways to solve each other's problems. And I guess that would be my last bit of advice.
And I think my last thing on that topic then would be, we were willing, I think, to be a little bit humble and say we didn't know it all. And I do that more in the context of building code and fire code. I think the easy thing, especially with fire, is it's life safety. Fire marshal has all power, and you got to give in. Jerry really understood the life safety code and alternate parts of the code, and he challenges us a lot. And I think the willingness for the fire marshal to come and be challenged and be part of that discussion was absolutely critical in this project.
Thank you both. That completes all the questions from today's presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for attending and give another thank you to our presenters. This was a great session, and thank you very much. I'd just like to remind you that we have recorded this session, and that it will be up on our YouTube channel within the next week. And we hope you join us at our next webinar next week on it's United Way Essential Services 211. So you can register for that on the website. We will have a follow-up relating to this issue and 866 and how to plan if your city is in the midst of the 866 issues. So with that, I wish everyone a happy Wednesday, and we will hopefully see you at the next NIFA session. Thank you.
Thank you.